This broadcast is brought to you by the Legatum Institute, an international think tank and educational charity. We hope you enjoy this event.
Hi, I'm Shanker Singham. I'm the Director of Economic Policy and Prosperity Studies at the Legatum Institute. We're sitting here in the Legatum Institute's library, and I'm here with John Penrose, MP for Weston-super-Mare, who is also a former businessman and former Constitution Minister of the UK government, and Philip Booth, who is the Director of Research and Public Engagement at St Mary's Twickenham and former Senior Fellow for Economic Policy at the IEA. And we're having a discussion this evening about ideas, big ideas that we're seeing in the UK happening not because of the Brexit vote, but I think what we're seeing is that the Brexit vote has created an opportunity for people to think strategically about the future of Britain in the world. And we're very, very pleased to have John and Philip here to talk about John's big idea, which is the prospect of the UK having or moving towards some sort of sovereign wealth fund to better manage assets. Legatum Institute senior fellow, a fellow of the Legatum Institute, Dag Detter, has done work on the management of resources and assets that are held by the UK, by the state, and how nations can better manage their resources. So this is building on a set of work that Legatum has already been deeply engaged in. And so, John, I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about the idea of a sovereign wealth fund for the UK, how you see this actually being put into practice. And then I'm going to ask Philip to respond. Philip and the IEA have just done a very interesting study on optimal levels of taxation. And so there's a tax issue here that comes into the discussion of a sovereign wealth fund. We wanted both of you together to talk about this. So, John, I'll turn to you first.
Well, thank you very much, Shanker. And I should start off by saying I completely agree with you that we seem to be at one of those moments, I think you and I have called it in the past an inflection point, where people are being forced to take half a step back and ask themselves some very fundamental questions, not just about what do we do to execute Brexit and what the details of that will look like, but also people are asking themselves broader questions about what kind of a country do we want to be once Brexit has happened. And the closest analogy I can come to, I think, is after the Second World War, for example, we had the emergence of the post-war consensus, and this country created the NHS, which had very little to do with rebuilding bomb-damaged buildings or anything like that, but was socially a direct result of people reconsidering the kind of country that they felt Britain might be. And they thought some very big thoughts. So I'm delighted that the Legatum Institute is starting to run a program of these kinds of things. I think we may be at one of those moments in our history, and I'm sort of hopeful mine will be a modest contribution, but there are many other ideas, I'm sure, bubbling out there. The idea behind this one is that it's always struck me that whether or not you talk to economists of the left or of the right, many of them, if you get them in the right mood, will say, look, as a country, we don't save enough. We rank near the bottom, if not at the bottom, of developed nations in terms of our savings rates. We tend not to invest very much, certainly not as much as many other developed economies. And that we are rather bad, therefore, at long-term planning, long-term development, and we're highly or relatively more dependent on consumer demand as an engine of economic growth rather than on investment. And that makes us economically weaker. It means that we have some inbuilt fragilities, some brittleness to our economy. And it makes it therefore harder for us to have steady and robust, resilient economic growth, if I can put it that way. So this idea started with that fundamental problem, which has been knocking around for decades, if not generations. And so I say, well, what might we be able to do about that, using the spur of Brexit to think some of these sort of challenge some of these things which we haven't really had a chance to address or challenge in the last 40 years or more. And really what I come to the conclusion is that one of our fundamental obstacles to solving this problem is that we are failing to confront the issue of generational equity, of generational justice. if you think about what it is reasonable for you and I as current taxpayers to pay for, and what it is reasonable to ask our children and our grandchildren to pay for, I think that it is clearly not reasonable for us to ask our children and our grandchildren to pay for your and my lifestyle today. It would be immoral, ethically wrong to lumber them with the bills of you and I living a great life now and expecting them to pay for it. So that's everything from the cost of policing and the cost of our education and our health and all these other things which actually go to make life in Britain good today. We should be paying for that stuff as we go along. But there are some things which we can legitimately say should be costs which are borne not just by the current generation but by future generations too. And those are things which future generations are going to benefit from and are going to be able to use themselves. So the classic example for that is economic infrastructure, so bridges and railways and ports and all those things, which you and I are enjoying the benefits of infrastructure which the Victorians built and we've maintained since, and which the post-war generation built as well. So we're talking about railways and then motorways, and I guess the current you and I as taxpayers at the moment, we're installing a whole new generation of digital infrastructure which our descendants will be able to use too. We can legitimately pay for those things with long-term debt, because the principle of generational justice is maintained, whereas it wouldn't be right and it wouldn't be fair to expect future generations to pay for all the rest of our lifestyle. And so therefore what we have to do is to move from a situation where at the moment we are not yet getting our budget into balance. But when we do get our budget into balance, when the deficit is eliminated, we need to move to a situation where we continue to keep it in balance, and that we therefore only borrow for building long-term bits of economic infrastructure which our children and our grandchildren can enjoy. And that means actually that in the short term we could start doing that now because we can continue to borrow for those sorts of things. So we could borrow a little bit more and perhaps delay the getting the budget into balance by a year or two in order to spend more money now on those things which are more roads, more rail, those sorts of infrastructure. But what it also means is that we then have to start confronting the rather painful reality that we've got an awful lot of debt already out there, not just gilts, government debt as it's usually defined, but also the liabilities which are embedded in our benefit system and in our pension system, which are effectively long-term liabilities, which are effectively the same as debt. And if you add those onto the cost of the existing gilts, the existing government bonds that are issued, you suddenly realise that actually the British public finances, the British national balance sheet, is a great deal more leveraged, a great deal more brittle than we perhaps like to admit to ourselves, and which we would normally, which the normal figures would show. Economists, again, of left and right, will say, if you have an economy and a government which is over-leveraged, then all sorts of things are not available to you. Governments are weaker. Good governments find it harder to do good things if they have to spend an awful lot of time spending money which is being soaked up either by debt repayments or by other programs which are politically sacred and can't be changed. So there is a huge advantage from getting the national balance sheet into a much stronger, less brittle position. But the only way that you can do that when the huge majority of those liabilities, the huge majority of that debt is embedded in our pension system and in our benefit system, is to switch slowly from a pay-as-you-go system, which is where today's pensioners have their pensions paid by today's taxpayers, to a funded system, i.e. the equivalent of if we had if the pension scheme, the state pension, was being run by someone like the Prudential, it would be done on a funded basis. Any other company pension scheme is done on a funded basis, and that means it's backed up by cold, hard investments of investment-grade assets, and they are saved up over time so that when you and I come to claim our pension, there's a big pot of investments behind it. That's where we haven't done it for the UK. That's where we need to get to. But in order to do the transition properly, we need to make sure that we aren't trying to get there all in one lump, because clearly it wouldn't be fair on today's taxpayers. We would be breaching our principle of generational justice the other way around. We'd be not being unfair to our children and grandchildren. We'd be being unfair to ourselves if we tried to do it all in one go. And therefore, the idea here is that we take a long time, several generations of slowly saving, rather like saving for your mortgage. You save a little bit over a very long period, month after month after month for 25 years, and for a country it would be for a great deal longer than that, in order to build up the kind of investment fund that would be required. And if you do that over a long, long time, several generations, as I said, then at the end of it, you end up with an economy which is far stronger, which has a far better balance sheet behind it, and which, most importantly of all, delivers on the ethical basis, the moral point of generational justice. It's fair to our children and our grandchildren because we aren't asking them to pay for things which we should be paying for ourselves.
Thank you, John. That was a very interesting take on the issue of part of it, obviously, is what we do about the national debt and what we do about the accumulation of debt in countries, particularly in developed countries around the world. So, Philip, I just ask you to react to John's suggestion, particularly with respect to this issue of intergenerational equity. What's your reflection on that?
Well, I think John's analysis is basically right. And indeed, I've been, and other IEA authors have been talking about this for a generation now, as it happens. And if action had been taken back in 1996, 1997, 1998, when we started discussing the issue, then the picture would look rather different. And indeed, the Conservative Party manifesto in 1997, and then again in 2001, and I had a hand in writing the pensions policy in 2001, actually suggested a movement in 1997, a huge movement, and in 2001 a slightly more modest movement towards funded pension schemes to try and reduce the problems that John has talked about. Now, I'd like to distill this down to two issues and look at the role of the state as against the private sector in both these areas, because I think that can help us understand what the best specific solutions are. So if we think about this issue of indebtedness and borrowing, it's true that the UK, private savers, businesses and so on, that private capital formation is low in the UK relative to other countries. But having said that, we shouldn't beat ourselves up too much about that. You can find countries such as Japan where saving is very high, but then returns on saving are very low because they have a very inefficient capital markets regulations on investing outside Japan and so on, which means that they get very low returns on their savings. That is not the case in the UK or in the US, which is another example of an economy which has liberal capital markets but relatively low levels of saving. At the same time, very few people die, very few families, very few individuals die and leave their children with debts. And most people die and leave their children with assets. Now, there is a tendency amongst those on the left to think that if we have a bigger private sector economy, then people will behave more selfishly, because the basic assumption of free market capitalism is that people behave selfishly. Well, funnily enough, no, in the private sphere, when it comes to the accumulation of assets, we actually do things to help our children. We leave them with assets. But in the public sphere, it's the other way around. We all vote in ways which leave our children with these huge debts, both the explicit debts, the government debt, which is about 80% of national income, but also the implicit debts, which John has talked about, which amount probably to 4 or 5 times national income. That is, these pensions and healthcare costs and so on that we vote ourselves, but without actually without actually making any financial contribution towards actually paying for these things. We're just leaving it to future generations of taxpayers. And of course, because our generation and the previous generation didn't have enough children, there aren't going to be enough taxpayers to pay for these benefits in the future. So that's the first thing. There is a tendency, I think, in government, in modern democracies, because of the way in which governments operate, unless you have very strict constitutional constraints, for governments to think short-term and to build up these debts. There are very few exceptions to this. The obvious exceptions are Switzerland, where they have strong constitutional constraints, and very localised government. Estonia, which is a special case, they had very radical reform after the Berlin Wall fell. Australia, where they've never had a universal state pension system. And Chile, when there was pension reform during a period of authoritarian dictatorship. And if you almost everywhere else in the world has similar problems to the UK, even if they're not quite as bad in terms of private saving. So that's one point I'd like to stress, which will then feed into what I think the ideal solution is. The second point is that the state on the whole is a very bad investor. And John talked about infrastructure that was developed in Victorian times. Well, Adam Smith talked about how the state needed to provide canals and roads and other public goods. Well, he was proved wrong. No, he was proved entirely wrong. The private sector produced the canals, roads, railways, etc., and which is a network which largely exists today. The railway network in particular is just simply inherited from the Victorians with very few additions. So the private sector can provide and build infrastructure, and in doing so is likely to take decisions which are less politicised, sounder in terms of their long-term profitability. And a good example of that, of course, is the government's own attitude towards infrastructure investment, so HS2 being a particularly good illustration of how short-termist the government is and how politicised government investment decisions are. So you might think HS2, 30 or 40-year project, just demonstrates how governments can think if they want to over a generation or more. Well, no. HS2 was conceived as a project in order to take attention away from the need to expand Heathrow Airport. David Cameron's view was that if we ship people up by railway to Birmingham, Manchester instead, we won't have to talk about airport expansion. It was a politically conceived project, which has far lower returns than all of the smaller infrastructure projects that governments could get involved with if they took decisions on an economically rational basis. So what I would say is that rather than the government borrowing in order to invest in infrastructure and other things, I do agree that that's a much more rational reason and sounder reason for borrowing rather than to spend on consumption. I would rather, once again, that we found mechanisms to ensure that the private sector actually put up the capital and took the risk, and roads in particular were properly priced so that that once there could be rational economic calculation, as I say, the private sector putting up the capital and taking the gains or losses. That would be my first point. That I think infrastructure investment, where it can be done, which I think is in nearly all cases, should be done by the private sector. Where it can't be done by the private sector, it should be done as local as possible, as near to the people as possible, so that you don't get these sort of big grandiose schemes that politicians like to attach their names to. The second point I would make is that if we are going to move towards a culture of saving rather than consumption, then I think this should be done in really more or less exactly the same way as the Conservative Party proposed in 1997 and again in 2001, which is essentially through gradually moving the pension system from a pay-as-you-go system with pensions provided by the government to a funded system along Chilean or along Australian lines, where people are there's a minimum level of compulsory saving. Thereafter, people are on their own, but there's some kind of minimum level of compulsory saving that people have to have during their working lives. But we also have to think about extending this not just to pensions, but also to healthcare. So in many ways, healthcare is rather like pensions. Indeed, the costs can actually be greater. So about 50% of all healthcare expenditure is incurred at the end of life, whenever that may be. So as longevity improves, then healthcare expenditures are pushed further and further out, but at some stage they will be incurred during in one's lifetime, and on by and large they are incurred towards the end of people's lives. Even people with long-term chronic conditions, they tend to appear towards the end of people's lives rather than people suffering them throughout their lives. So I think we also have to have some kind of system whereby people both insure on a long-term basis, but also actually have some kind of savings account like they have in Singapore, which can be used for healthcare needs, for pensions, or for long-term care on a relatively flexible basis. And an additional advantage of that is that it puts the consumer actually makes the individual, the potential patient, more responsible at least for their own healthcare decisions. So in Singapore, you find that people actually look after their health better because they know that they're going to pay for their own healthcare in the future. And we also know that when either the government or an insurer is in charge of paying for healthcare, you get much less good value for money than when individuals are actually paying for treatment themselves. I mean, that's true even in the UK system to the limited extent that individuals do personally pay for treatment at the moment. Now, I'm not saying that people should be exposed to the risk of needing 10 years of treatment for cancer or diabetes or something like that, but allowing people, encouraging people, possibly to some extent requiring people in place of state provision to actually save for some of their healthcare needs throughout their working lives, along with having healthcare insurance, I think would complement a pensions reform and get us back to the situation where people actually save for these needs rather than relying on future generations of taxpayers to provide for them.
And you could also do something similar with education savings accounts, and you could have healthcare savings accounts, education savings accounts. So you're talking about sort of trusts, essentially, in a way. John, one issue with any time a sovereign wealth fund is mentioned, the issue is, as Philip sort of implied, are you crowding out private sector ways of solving some of these problems? Is the government crowding out private sector ways of some of these problems? Or is there some way that your idea, your sovereign wealth fund, could be blended into this need for savings accounts so that you're not taking people out of the competitive process, but they're not necessarily competing with entirely their own resources, understanding that people in poverty have much more limited resources. Is this something that could be married to your idea? And also this issue of, are you crowding out private sector solutions?
Let me take the point about crowding out first, because I think that there is always a danger, not only of crowding out, but also, as I think Philip was mentioning, of political grand projet, and therefore either misinvestment or malinvestment taking hold. And therefore, if we're going to build up an enormous investment fund, then it inevitably becomes a honeypot for people either with good intent or bad, but it's going to have an enormous amount of political attention paid to it. And we therefore need to make sure that there are some extremely strong institutional bulwarks around it to make sure that it is properly invested and that it is not eroded by people who, with the best will in the world, will be trying to use it for other purposes. And if we're talking about a prospect or a process which is going to take, in the case of Chile, they're taking 70 years, for example. Philip mentioned Chile. They're taking 70 years to make the transition to a fully invested fund. It's quite possible that in the UK we might decide to take an even longer period. And therefore, having strong institutions around it which are politically robust to deal with the inevitable huge political risk of successive changes of government over that 70 or 80 or 90 plus year timescale, and make sure that the project isn't derailed in that period, matters too. And therefore, what I'm proposing is that we have some institutions which do several things. Firstly, on the investment side, we have a very, very strong and heavyweight independent board of trustees, the trustees of the investment trust, effectively, who would be subject to the same duties and the same rules as pension fund trustees in the private sector. So they would have to invest in high-quality assets. They would be able to invest all the way around the world if necessary, which incidentally spreads the risks a great deal more broadly and is a far better option than a pay-as-you-go system which limits your risks to your ability to tax the UK economy with all the pluses and minuses that may have to it. But it means that, therefore, because they can only invest in proper investment-grade assets and they are subject to the same transparency and reporting requirements, both in terms of assessing how big the liabilities are, but also what the value of the assets is, that it is a great deal harder for people to, and particularly politicians, to either subvert or erode the trust's independence. And let me give you an example. One of the easy tricks which governments of any stripe are always prone to or prey to is to change the long-term liabilities in the pension scheme or in the state pension system or in the benefit system by giving somebody, often a favoured set of voters, an additional set of rights underneath the benefit system. That can, at a stroke, add billions to the value of the liabilities which you and I as taxpayers are on the hook for. I mean, it hardly ever gets noticed because it is incredibly complicated. It's usually buried in footnotes somewhere right at the back of a red book, if it's there at all. But if we were to subject it to the same reporting requirements as a private sector pension scheme, then those liabilities are instantly calculated, instantly reported on, instantly crystallised. So it's very, very clear when a politician tries to do something surreptitious that that's what they've done. And all of a sudden everyone turns around and goes, hang on a second, you just increased the value of the debts that we now owe by the following vast amount. Equally, it allows us then to say, well, are we getting closer to funding those liabilities properly as we build up our investment funds? So if it was 60% funded last year and we put in some more money and we've gone backwards to 58% funded this year, we're going in the wrong direction. Why is that happening? What's going on? It reduces the number of places that there are to hide and for people to play silly so-and-sos with either the liabilities or the assets. Absolutely essential to trust, as you pointed out. Absolutely essential to make sure that people are therefore subjected to the same rigours that we would expect of anyone else, of investing sensibly, of not investing in grand projet or I won't comment on whether or not HS2 is a good project or a bad project, but we can all think of examples of where things have not been invested as well as they could be or should be. And therefore these institutional bulwarks for transparency, for having strong independent trustees, rather like the Court of the Bank of England, and for reporting on these things regularly are absolutely essential if we're to make this happen. One final point I would also add, if I can. Philip is absolutely right that there are huge social implications here too, because if we do this, then what we end up with is an asset-owning democracy on a scale which Margaret Thatcher's sale of council houses could only have dreamt of. What it gives is everybody, whether or not they are a high earner or a low earner, a stake in the country's financial future, a stake in the country's financial balance sheet. Everybody then starts to care about whether or not the balance sheet is being well looked after or not. It isn't a question, as it so often is with public sector goods, of, well, I'll grab as much as I can and I'll try and see if someone else can pick up the costs, which is the political dynamic which Philip started off his comments by trying to describe, and describe very clearly. And it stops that happening because everybody has a stake. Everybody knows that their stake is being destroyed if things go in the wrong direction. Mm-hmm. And it means that we therefore create this sort of asset-owning democracy on a scale which we have only ever dreamt of in the past. And it emphasises this idea of social justice as well. It emphasises this idea that we are all responsible for our own actions. We all contribute to our own assets, but we are also part of a broader society as well. And it doesn't matter if we are rich or poor. It doesn't matter if we are high earners or low earners. We are doing the right thing by both us and our family and our communities, and we're also doing the right thing by our children and our grandchildren too.
Can I comment on that?
Of course, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, these institutional issues, I think, are of interest in a number of contexts to the Legatum Institute. You study them in various areas of your work. And they are key, and there are good examples from which we can learn, both successful examples and unsuccessful examples. So countries such as Argentina, Hungary, and to an extent recently Poland, have effectively taken over the pension assets of individuals which they've saved under the reformed systems of the 1990s. The state has nationalised those assets, used them to write off government debt, and given the people pension rights in the state pay-as-you-go pension system in return. So effectively, the state has reduced its explicit debt and increased its implicit debt, its pay-as-you-go social security debt. Now, there are three reasons, I suppose, why that's happened. One is that investors, for some reason, and the IMF, don't seem to look through these implicit pay-as-you-go social security liabilities sufficiently when they are examining whether or not a government is creditworthy. So there isn't the same market pressure for a government to reduce its pay-as-you-go social security liabilities as there is to reduce its explicit debt. Secondly, in these countries, although perhaps I'm surprised it's happened in Poland to some extent, although Poland has only had a non-communist government for 30 years, or less than 30 years. But it's happened in countries which don't have a good record of institutional soundness, respect for property rights, and this type of thing. So one would predict, I guess, that this would happen in Argentina rather than Chile. But thirdly, it's happened because the whole system has been set up in a way in which it makes it relatively easy for the government to do that. And this is where perhaps some clarification. I'm not sure whether I'm disagreeing with John or not, because I'm not sure precisely of the details. But I think the biggest bulwark against this sort of thing happening is, firstly, for the government to really allow competition. So people can either invest this with some kind of government-sponsored vehicle. I'll come back to that in a second, because I'm a bit wary of government-sponsored vehicles, but I think this can be done in a relatively acceptable way, or if they wish, a whole range of private sector providers. And secondly, the more freedom that people have to save in their own way, for their future healthcare, long-term care and pension needs, and to mix up that saving with other general saving, the more difficult it is for the government to identify one component of that and kind of take those assets away and replace it with a state benefit. Now, what would I regard as a potential acceptable government intervention here? Well, actually, I think NEST, National Employee Savings Scheme, is that what the initials stand for, is actually a reasonably good vehicle that the government has established, but the government doesn't actually own it. It is now a distinct trust, and it's entirely debt financed, so it doesn't really have any defined ownership. I suppose it's a bit like, except these were established in the private sector in the 19th century, it's a bit like the Trustees Savings Bank in terms of its ownership. So the government is very hands-off, but the government does kind of regulate its charges and this type of thing, and employees are free to invest using this vehicle, and the trustees have a particular set of investment policies, and employees, if they wish, can transfer out of that vehicle and into other vehicles, or choose to use other vehicles instead. So this government vehicle, which you could say has reasonably close to best practice when it comes to things like charges and investment policy, is there as an alternative for employees. But it's not the only alternative. It's in there in competition with other private sector operators in the marketplace.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. One issue is tax on your plan for the Sovereign Wealth Fund. Part of your plan includes a set of tax recommendations. Obviously, we've got the IEA's view of the optimal level of taxation that Philip has just been involved with. Can you outline a little bit your tax proposals, and then we'll have Philip sort of react to those?
Yeah, absolutely. Because part of the difficulty, as I said, is that we need to find a mechanism to build up and then maintain this fund, which is politically robust, because it's going to have to last for decades. And then once the thing has been built up, it's got to then persist for generations after that. And so the temptation will be, while this fund is being built up, for governments to take a holiday from the contributions whenever times are tough, or indeed when they aren't tough, but just politicians have decided they're feeling the heat for political reasons rather than economic ones. So every time there's a recession, every time there's an election coming up, the temptation will rise for economically suboptimal things to happen, and for people to start raiding piggy banks all over the place. How do we avoid that? Well, the aim is to create something which, to begin with, is entirely fiscally neutral. It doesn't add to the tax burden at all. But at the moment when we get the budget back into balance, when the deficit is gone, that will be the moment when we could, if we have the political will, start to address this issue of our accumulated debt, of our rather fragile balance sheet. And at that point, what I'm proposing is that we take the money that we are expecting to pay out in debt interest at that point, which will be probably 2% or so of GDP. It's what it's scheduled to be at the moment. It might end up being 2.1% or something like that in the early 2020s, depending on what's announced in the autumn statement. And we carve that out of income tax at the moment. We reduce income tax by the equivalent amount, and we create this thing called the national debt charge. It's rather like a national insurance contribution. The national debt charge basically just is the bit that we were going to spend anyway on debt interest. And we pay that national debt charge directly to the Bank of England, because they're the people who manage the national debt. They manage the gilts, the government bonds. And we maintain that level at whatever it is, 2%, 2.1% at the time. And we maintain it going forward. Now, because we're going to be running a balanced budget, there are a series. I've got some other proposals about how we make sure that is maintained, and that the golden rule in one of its various forms is followed. Because we're going to be managing a balanced budget, that means that as the economy grows and the debt overall, the government bonds, basically stay steady, over time, very, very slowly, we will start to have a little bit of surplus extra in this national debt charge, which won't be needed to pay for interest, because the economy will grow. The 2% of that economy, of GDP, will therefore start to be a bit more than we need to just fund the debt interest. And that's the piece that gets put into either creating the sovereign wealth fund, or if you wanted to, I suppose you could use it to pay down the debt itself, depending on whichever one's going to give you the best financial term. But you need to sort of take a view on that as the thing goes. The important thing there is that because it's a national debt charge, and it's an independent thing and it's paid directly to the Bank of England, it is, again, institutionally independent. It's harder for politicians to meddle with. And the bit which just makes it even harder still is that when the Chancellor of the day, Philip Hammond, we assume, is setting this thing up, which will be in a couple of years' time, what I'm expecting him to do, what I'm suggesting that he should do, is he should set a date by which the Sovereign Wealth Fund would be completely invested. So the date by which we would have amassed enough of a sovereign wealth fund to fund all those liabilities in the pension system and in the benefit system that I'm talking about. That date will probably could be 70 years hence, could be 90 years hence, could even be 120 years hence, but he needs to choose a date and set it. And at that point, then, the trustees of the National Sovereign Wealth Fund would effectively write a letter, a public letter, to the Chancellor of the Exchequer of the day each year during that time, rather like the Governor of the Bank of England writes to the Chancellor at the moment if we are missing our inflation target, saying we are on track or we are not on track to hit that date. And if successive governments further down the track don't maintain the national debt charge at the right level, then the government, the trustees will then have to write a letter saying, actually, you're falling short. We need more money coming into this, and it's going to be a public letter. It's going to be extremely embarrassing, politically embarrassing, for any chancellor to have to deal with that. So the easy thing to do will be just to maintain this level of national debt charge at the, whatever it is, let's say it's 2%, throughout that period of time, because that should get us to the target date. And at that point, politically, it's the easy life is not to contradict it, not to get one of these letters saying, hang on a second, red flag, it's all going horribly wrong, klaxons are going off, it's a big problem. And that is the guarantee, ultimately, that the system is going to be politically robust, and it's going to be harder for successive governments to raid it or to erode it or to, in any other way, yield to the temptations of either economically difficult times or of politically difficult times, of which there inevitably will be many if we're talking about a timescale of 70 or 90 or even 120 years. And that's the way you've got to do it in order to make sure that politicians of any future government, no matter which political stripe it may be, don't fall prey to those inevitable pressures which will come. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when and how often.
Mm-hmm. So national debt charge. So the idea, if I'm sort of expressing it correctly, is that you would actually take this out of the income tax rate. So you're essentially taking a piece of the income tax rate and making it very concretely show people basically that this is part of their national debt obligations of this current generation.
This is your national mortgage payment on your mortgage every month. It's the equivalent of that coming out of your pay packet every month, the moment after it's landed after your salary's landed in your account.
So that being the case, and you are able to therefore lower the generalised income tax rate. Is this something that? What's your reaction to this? Because you think that an IEA's report recently shows that our overall level of taxation is way beyond what is economically sensible in terms of consumer welfare enhancement and so forth.
Yep.
So.
I must admit I'm quite nervous about this whole mechanism, this whole way of doing things. I mean, firstly, the sort of amounts of money we're talking about, a couple of % of national income, are very small in relation to what is needed to fund somebody's future healthcare and pension payments. Now, of course, this. In terms of total national income, it might be that an individual needs perhaps 10 to 15% to save 10 to 15% of their income in order to provide themselves with a pension and healthcare in old age. Now, the proportion of national income which is needed to do that for society as a whole will vary according to longevity, the birth rate, the shape of the pension system, and that type of thing. And now, I can understand the attractiveness of this type of system, which seems to be using a rather, even at arm's length, government, state-based investment operation with, say, relatively small sums of money when it comes to the government's own pension liabilities in respect of its own employees, say the armed forces, civil servants, and so on. And I think this may well be a reasonable way forward in those cases. And in fact, Canada and I think the United States have begun to make steps along this path of setting aside funds for future pay-as-you-go pensions for government employees. I'm very nervous about this type of approach for the population as a whole. I think it's much better if we, if you like, diversify risk, give people more freedom, allow competition in the market, allow people to make their own provision. Sure, as I suggested before, perhaps the government could set up a vehicle which was employing what it might regard as best practice when it comes to investment and charging and so on, as long as it was a very arm's length vehicle, which was available to employees for their savings. But on the whole, I would prefer people to be saving through, or at least have the option to be saving through individual accounts. Now, so how would you operationalise this in terms of the national finances? Well, what I've proposed before, and I still think this is the most viable mechanism, is really exactly the approach that governments of all colours, literally from Tony Benn as Paymaster General to Mrs Thatcher implementing the 1986 Social Security Act proposed, which was allowing people to contract out of the state pension system. I would extend that to the healthcare system. I would reformalise the national insurance system so that national insurance was a payroll tax which paid for healthcare, pensions, and possibly some other insurances such as disability and so on. And I would allow people, first of all, on an optional basis, and possibly it might become compulsory one day, to opt out of the national insurance system to get an actuarially neutral rebate, as it was called, which they would then use to find their own health provision, fund health savings accounts, funds pension savings, and so on. And this was a system which worked brilliantly well for 30 or 40 years. And the only problem came when Gordon Brown systematically reduced the national insurance rebates that people got relative to the value of the state pensions that they were foregoing by contracting out of the state pension system. And as a result of that, financial advisors had to tell people to stop contracting out of the state pension system. And that was a problem which I think could easily have been solved if the Conservative government or the coalition government had the will to do so in 2010. But unfortunately, they adopted Liberal Democrat pension policy at the time, which was to abolish this whole system. They could have resolved that by setting up an independent body, rather like the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee, to adjudicate on what a fair actuarial rebate of national insurance contributions should be for those people who opt out of state provision for pensions and healthcare, and for those rebates to be actually challengeable in the court if they were not regarded as fair value. So really, I would reheat, if you like, a an approach, and I would extend it further into the pension system and also into the into healthcare provision, which has been used very effectively by both Conservative and Labour governments in the past, from the mid-1950s until Gordon Brown came along in 1997.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Thank you very much, John. Thank you, Philip. That was a great conversation. First of our big ideas events, and we look forward to hearing how the proposal gets picked up and continuing to work with you both.
To hear more podcasts from the Legatum Institute, please visit our iTunes channel or website at www.li.com.